The Beasts of Moulder. The plague had come to Nuln. Fear stalked the streets. Not even the corrupt authorities could keep a lid on all the rumours that flew back and forth. On every street corner, one began to hear tales of mutants and ratmen and huge wild-eyed rats which brought death and disease to all they encountered. I can now reveal some of the sinister truths behind those rumours. From My Travels with Gotrek, Volume 3, by Herr Felix Jäger, Altdorf Press, the year 2505. "You're moving in such high society these days, Felix," Heinz the landlord said, giving Felix Jäger an uneasy grin. "What do you mean?" the younger man asked. "This came for you when you were out." He handed Felix a sealed letter. "'Twas delivered by a footman in the tabard of Her Highness, the Countess Emmanuel, no less. He had a couple of the city guard to keep him company too." A sudden sick feeling grabbed Felix in the pit of his stomach. His eyes flickered towards the door, making sure he had a clear way out. It looked like his past had caught up with him at last. Quickly, he reviewed all the things the authorities might want him for. Well, there was a standing bounty on his and Gotrek's heads, posted by the authorities in Altdorf for their involvement in the window tax riots. There was the fact that he had murdered the Countess's chief of secret police, Fritz von Hallstatt. Not to mention the fact that they had been involved in burning her new College of Engineering to the ground. How had they found him? Had they been recognized by one of the hundreds of informers who swarmed through the city? Or was it something else entirely? Where was Gotrek? Perhaps if they moved quickly enough, they could still escape the jaws of the trap. "Aren't you going to read it then?" Heinz asked, naked curiosity showing in his eyes. Felix shook his head, his reverie broken. He realized that his heart was pounding and his palms were sweating. Noting the way Heinz was looking at him, he realized that he must look guilty as sin. He forced a sickly grin onto his face. "Read what?" "The bloody letter, idiot! You must be able to tell we're all dying of curiosity here." Felix glanced around and saw that Alyssa, Heinz, and the rest of the staff were all staring at him quite openly, keen to know what business the ruler of the great city-state might have with him. Of course, Felix said, forcing himself to remain calm, to make his hands stop shaking. He walked over to his customary chair by the fire and sat down. The horde of curious onlookers followed him over and scrutinized his face intently. Felix glared at them meaningfully until they all backed off, then gave his consideration to the letter. It was inscribed on the very finest vellum, and his name was written in good quality ink. There were no blots or smudges, and whoever the scribe was possessed a fine hand indeed. The wax seal had not been broken, and it showed the crest of the Elector Countess. A measure of calm returned to Felix. You did not write letters to men you were going to arrest. If you were a stickler for formalities, you read them the warrant and then clapped them in irons. If you were the Elector Countess Emmanuel, your thugs bashed them over the head with a club and they woke up in chains in the Iron Tower. Perhaps, he told himself, things were not going to be so bad after all. Still, he doubted this. In his experience, in this life, whatever could go bad, did go bad. With nervous fingers he broke the seal and studied the message within. It was written in the same beautiful and courtly hand as the address, and was as simple as it was enigmatic. Herr Jaeger, you are commanded to present yourself at the palace of Her Serene Highness, the Countess Emmanuel, at the evening bell on this day. Yours in faith, Hieronymus Ostwald, Secretary to Her Serene Highness. How very curious, thought Felix, turning the letter over and over in his hands, as if by doing so he would find some clue as to why he was being summoned. There was none. He was left to wonder what the ruler of one of the greatest fiefdoms of the empire might want with a penniless, mercenary wanderer, and no answers were forthcoming. He realized that everybody was still staring at him. He stood up and smiled. It's all right. I've just been invited to visit the Countess, he said eventually. Elissa still looked impressed and a little shocked, as if she could not quite believe there wasn't some mistake. It's a great honour, she told him as they sat together by the fire. I'm sure it's nothing. It's probably for my brother, Otto. He was sent here by mistake. He reached out and took her hand. She pulled it away quickly. She had been doing that a lot recently. You will go, won't you? She said, and smiled. Of course. I cannot refuse a command from the local ruler. Then what will you wear? He was going to say, my own clothes, of course, but immediately saw her point. His tunic was stained and soiled in 100 places from all the brawling and fights he had been in. His cloak was ragged and ripped at the hems where strips had been torn from it to make bandages. His boots were holed and cracked. His breeches were patched and filthy. He looked more like a beggar than a warrior. He doubted that he would be able to get past the front of the gate looking like he did. They were more likely to throw him a bone and send him away with his kicks. Don't worry, he said. I'll think of something. Best do it quickly then. You've only got 8 hours till the evening bell. Felix looked across the desk at his brother. Newly bathed and with his tattered clothes hastily washed and dried in front of the fire, he felt self-conscious. His hands toyed idly with the silvered pomander which dangled from his neck. He wished he'd never come to the warehouse where Otto's office was located. Otto got up from behind his heavy oaken desk and lumbered over to the window. He put his hands behind his back. Felix noticed that his right hand was clutching his left wrist. It was an old habit of Otto's. He had always done that when called upon to answer difficult questions by their tutors. Well, I only see you when you want something, Felix, he asked eventually. Felix felt a surge of guilt. Otto had a point. The only times he had been near his brother recently was when he needed a favour, like he did now. He considered the question. It wasn't that he disliked Otto, it was just that they had nothing much in common anymore, and perhaps Felix feared that he would ask him to join the business again, and he would have to refuse again. I've been busy, he said. Doing what? Crawling through graveyards, burning scholarly institutions to the ground, fighting monsters, killing things, Felix thought, wondering how much, if any, of this he would ever be able to tell his brother. Fortunately, Otto did not give him a chance to reply, as he had some suggestions of his own. Brawling, I suppose. Hanging about with tavern wenches and rakes, frittering away that expensive education father paid for, when you should be here, helping run the business, following in the family tradition, helping to make... Felix could not tell whether Otto was angry or simply hurt. He fought to keep his own feelings under control. He stretched his legs out, pushing the chair back until it rested on its rear legs. A huge portrait of his father glared down at him from behind Otto's desk. Even from up there, the old man managed to look somehow disapproving. Do you know the Countess Emmanuel? The question interrupted the flow of Otto's ranting, as Felix had intended it to. His brother stopped, turned around, and looked sharply at his younger brother. I met her on the last high feast day of Verena, when I was presented at court. She seemed a spirited and somewhat flighty young woman. Otto paused and turned away from the window. He slumped back into his comfortable chair again and opened a huge ledger. He had marked his place with a quill pen. It was a gesture so reminiscent of his father that Felix smiled. For a moment, Otto's brow furrowed in concentration. He dipped the pen in the inkwell and inscribed something in the ledger. Without looking at Felix, he said, I've heard some rumours about her. Felix leaned forward until he almost touched Otto's neatly arranged desk. The front legs of his chairs clanked back onto the stone floor. Rumours? Otto cleared his throat and smiled in embarrassment. She's supposed to be somewhat wild. More than that. Actually, it's not uncommon at Emmanuel's court. They are, shall we say, a little less than moral. Wild? Felix inquired. His interest was piqued. In what way? She's said to be the mistress of half the young nobles of the empire. Has a particular fondness for rakes and duelists. There have been a number of scandals, apparently. Only rumours, of course, and I don't pay attention to any gossip, he added hastily, like a man who fears that what he is saying might suddenly be overheard. Why do you ask? Felix placed the letter on top of the ledger which Otto had been studying. His brother picked it up and turned it over in his hands. He studied the broken seal, then slid the parchment from out of the envelope and read it. Otto smiled the same cold and calculating smile that their father showed in the portrait above. So, you're moving amongst the nobility now. I won't ask how this has come about. It had been their father's ambition to buy the family's way into the nobility for as long as he could remember. So far, he had not succeeded, but Felix reckoned that it was only a matter of time. The old man was both wealthy and persistent. Otto continued to give him that long, measuring look. He ran his eyes over Felix's odd and tattered clothing. Of course, you'll need money, he said eventually. Felix looked back, considering his options. He didn't really want to take his family's money, but under the circumstances, it seemed advisable. He would certainly need better clothing for his visit to the court. Yes, brother, he said. Felix walked out through the warehouse door, feeling slightly sick of himself. The The pouch of gold jingling within his jerkin was like a badge of his betrayal of his own ideals. The letter from Otto instructing any of the Jaeger businessmen to give him what he required seemed tainted with his own greed. After so much time spent shunning his family, the generosity seemed almost excessive. Felix shook his head and strode across to the river wharfs. He looked down into the grey, misty murk of the Reich and studied the great barges which had come all the way from Altdorf, carrying their cargoes of Bretonnian wines and Astalian silks. They lay at rest along the piers, like whales momentarily surfaced, bobbing in the river flow. He watched the sweating dockhands lifting the casks from the holds with hooked knives, and saw them roll heavy barrels up long gangplanks towards the warehouse. And he heard loud coughs and saw men holding handkerchiefs over their mouths. The plague had claimed hundreds over the past few weeks. It seemed that his and Gotrek's efforts in the Garden of Moor had at best slowed its spread, and at worst had no effect at all. He wondered how it was spread, and in his mind he pictured the rats that the plague monk had been dipping into that vile cauldron. Somehow he just knew they had something to do with it. One of the men, older than the rest, remembered Felix from his younger days. He raised his hand and waved at him. Felix waved back. He could not even remember the man's name, but he was shocked to find him still labouring away after all these years. The dock worker had not been young even then. Here, Felix thought, was the difference between the nobility of the empire and those they ruled. That docker would continue to work for the pittance which the Jaeger family paid him until he keeled over and died. The nobles would lounge in their palaces, collecting the revenues of their estates, and never raise their hands in honest toil in all their lives. There were times when Felix found himself in agreement with the revolutionists who preached rebellion across the empire. He smiled ironically. Fine words, he told himself, for a man who had just taken a hefty handout from his own rich family. Well, he had not made this world, he just had to live in it. He turned and walked along the bank of the river, losing himself in the sounds and smells and sights of the dockside. The smell of fish assaulted his nostrils. Felix gagged and held the pomander he had acquired from Dr. Drexler under his nose. Its perfumed scent was starting to fade, but it was still strong enough to sweeten the tainted air. Felix noticed that the smells of the street and other people seemed keener now that he'd had his first bath in weeks. The rumble of huge drayage carts competed with the shouts of the dock workers. An armed guard in the black tabard of the city state stopped to take a pear from the cart of a small trader. A child pickpocket made a daring rush for the purse of an old trader too poor to afford bodyguards. It was all very much as Felix remembered it from his childhood visits to Nuln with his father and brothers. He headed onwards, making for the better part of town. He had a niggling feeling that someone was following him, but when he turned around to look, no one was there. Felix studied his reflection in the mirror. Very nice, he thought. He knew he cut a fine figure. At the best of times he was tall, athletic, and quite good looking, if he said so himself. Now he was dressed to make the most of it. He took a deep breath, reveling in the smell of luxury, of oak panelling and fine old leather. This discreet tailor's shop, catering only to the highest category of nobles, was one of the Jaeger family's less well-known businesses. It had not even existed when Felix had last been in Nuln. It had been set up by Otto, using introductions passed on by the late Fritz von Hallstatt. For once, Felix was glad of Otto's corrupt association with the man he had killed. His fine new clothes felt strange. The high leather boots pinched. The tunic felt a little stiff. The padded lining felt too soft. The white linen shirt smelled too fresh. He realized how used he had become to the harsh life on the road, when he had not changed his clothes for months. Only the new cloak of red Sudanland wool felt familiar. It resembled his old one, ruined by Skaven blood during the attack on the blind pig. The sword he had taken from the Templar, Aldred, was encased in a fine new sheath of plain black leather. "Would Sir like any alterations made?" the assistant asked obsequiously. Felix studied the bald-headed, sour-faced fellow. Only an hour ago, when Felix had entered the shop, the assistant had inspected him as if he were a particularly large and repulsive cockroach. In a way, Felix could not blame him. He had been dressed like a beggar. Of course, the assistant's attitude had changed within seconds of reading Otto's hastily scrawled note. When Otto Jaeger himself told his minions to give this client anything he wanted, fawning courtesy was thrown in as part of the bargain. Felix gave the man his best condescending smile. "No, I would like several copies of these garments delivered to my residence within the day, and have my old clothing packed and returned immediately." "Of course, sir." "And where would Sir's residence be?" "At the sign of the Blind Pig, in the new quarter. Have the clothes delivered to Felix Jaeger." Felix enjoyed looking at the man's face when he gave the address. He looked as if he had just swallowed that large and particularly nasty cockroach. "The Blind Pig, sir? Isn't that "Where I stay is my own business, don't you think?" "Of course, sir. It is simply that Sir took one rather by surprise for a moment. 1,000 apologies." "No need. Just make sure my clothes are delivered on time." "I will see to it personally, sir." Felix wondered if the man would have the nerve to come to the new quarter himself. Maybe he would. He was obviously paid enough to make it worth his while to stay in Felix's favour. "Will that be all, sir?" "For the moment, yes." Felix emerged from the tailor's into the late afternoon gloom. He glanced around. No pursuers were visible. If there had actually been any, perhaps they had grown bored with waiting while Felix was in the tailor's. He hoped so, at least. He noticed he was standing taller, and he felt more poised than he had before. He carried himself like a different man from the weary wanderer who had presented himself at Otto Jaeger's warehouse earlier. It was amazing the difference a bath and a change of clothes could make in a man. A feeling of nervous anticipation had been gathering in his stomach all day. It was not quite fear. It was more like a vague uneasiness about what he would encounter within Elector Countess Emmanuel's palace. He was forced to admit that he prayed he would not embarrass himself in front of the nobility. He considered that thought for a moment, then forced a smile. His manners were good. He was well spoken and well dressed. There was nothing to be afraid of. Yet he knew this was not true. The nobility did not like upstart newcomers from the merchant class. During his time at university, he had endured many snubs by young nobles who had taken pains to communicate this to him. At the same time, he had always resented being looked down on by people who were often stupider and less well educated than he, whose only qualification was that they happened to be born into the right inbred bloodline. Now he could not help but laugh at himself. He was certainly not working himself into the correct frame of mind for this interview. He thanked Sigmar for small mercies. At least Gotrek had not been summoned as well. He could just picture a confrontation between the local highborn and the sullen troll-slayer. It would be an encounter fated to end in disaster. Felix had never known the Slayer to show deference to anything or anyone, and he doubted that the Countess or her minions would appreciate his independence of spirit. Suddenly, a new problem presented itself, and one that he had not even bothered to consider earlier. The streets were muddy and full of rubbish. The gutters were overflowing. The crowds were unwashed and tightly pressed. He could not get to the palace without some of the dirt of the streets transferring itself to his superb new clothes. He knew it would never do to appear at the palace looking less than immaculate. He glanced around, hoping that a solution would present itself. He gestured with his arm, summoning a passing palanquin. The litter's curtains were open, showing it was for hire. The two burly bearers approached him deferentially. Felix was startled for a moment. Normally two such bravos would have cursed him or exchanged coarse jibes, but now they were all attentive with respect. Of course, he realized it was the clothes. They saw him as a rich noble and a potentially lucrative fare. It was an impression which was in no way diminished when he said, "The palace," and swiftly. He clambered into the plushy upholstered seat, and the bearers set off at a fast, striding pace. Felix pulled open the curtains at the back of the palanquin, checking to see if he was being followed once more. Was it just his imagination, or had someone just ducked back into the mouth of that alley? The way to the palace was steep and winding. The townhouses of the nobility arrayed themselves around the highest hill in the city. From where Felix sat, he could see a fine view of the roofs of the merchants below, and the great curve of the river Reich. He could see the spires of the temples and a great building site where workmen laboured to rebuild the College of Engineering. Horses' hooves clattered on the cobbled streets. Coaches swept past. Servants in the liveries of a dozen famous families swarmed everywhere, carrying messages, leading beasts, holding great satchels full of provisions. The lowest of them were better dressed than some of the city's merchants, and the highest ranking wore uniforms scarcely less ornate than a mercenary captain's. Everyone looked cleaner and better fed than the commoners down below. Here and there, nobles garbed in splendid raiment walked with their retainers and bodyguards, the crowd parting as if under the influence of some mysterious force before them. Felix studied their haughtiness, thinking that he recognized a few of the younger ones who played at being poor in a blind pig of an evening. He doubted that any of them would recognize him now. Ahead of them loomed the walls of the palace. It dwarfed the stately townhouses around it. Even now, with its walls replastered and ornate statuary lining the approach, it looked far more like a fortress than a palace. The great arch of the gateway was huge, and the heavy oaken gates were shod with bronze and looked like they could resist 100 battering rams. Sentries barred the entrance and scrutinized all who attempted to pass. Some were recognized immediately and allowed to go in unhindered. Others were stopped and challenged, and Felix guessed he would be in the latter category. He tapped on the canopy of the palanquin to indicate that they should stop, paid the footmen the 2 silver shillings and added another shilling for a tip, then watched them depart. He patted his tunic to make sure his summons was still there, then strode as confidently as he could manage in the direction of the gate. When one of the guards asked him his business, he showed them the letter and the seal and was surprised when a tall, lean man garbed in all black emerged from within the gatehouse. He looked at Felix with cold, grey eyes. "Herr Jäger," he said in a calm, emotionless voice, "if you would be so good as to accompany me, I would explain the nature of this business on the way." Filled with sudden trepidation, Felix fell into step beside him. He could not help but notice that 2 armed guards dogged their steps. They moved down long corridors, passed through a series of galleries and an enormous ballroom, before going down some steps into the dungeons below. Somewhere in the distance, the evening bell tolled. Felix studied the office warily. It was large and sumptuously furnished, not at all what he had expected. He had expected a torture chamber or a cell, but not this. Nevertheless, the 2 men-at-arms had followed them in and positioned themselves against the far wall where they stood, immobile. As Felix watched, a lamp lighter in the library of the palace entered, carrying a small ladder. Another bearing only a lit taper clambered up the ladder and lit the candles set in the massive chandelier. Its light dimmed the rays of the setting sun that filtered in through the narrow window. The tall man gestured to the massive leather armchair which sat in front of his equally enormous desk. "Please, Herr Jäger, be seated." Felix allowed himself to sink into the chair. The tall man wandered over to the window and stared out for a moment, before pulling the heavy brocade drapes closed. He considered the window as if he were looking at it for the first time. It was narrow, obviously designed as an arrow slit. "This place was a fortress before it was a palace," he said. His words hung in the air. Felix turned them over, wondering if there was some hidden meaning. He did not respond, but waited for the man to continue, to amplify his statement if he was going to. The man considered this and smiled for the first time. His teeth were a brilliant white, and made even his pale skin look sallow. "Forgive me, Herr Jaeger, you are not quite what I expected." "And what did you expect, Herr?" The man bowed as one would to an opponent who had just scored a point in a fencing match. "Forgive me once more. It has been a long and harrowing day, and I quite forget my manners. I am Hieronymus Ostwald. I am the personal secretary to Her Serenity." Felix was not sure whether he should rise and bow back. He was not given the chance. Ostwald moved swiftly behind his desk and sat down. Felix noticed that even in that comfortable chair, he sat with his back straight, like someone used to the iron discipline of a soldier. "In answer to your question, from the description I had of you, I expected someone less polished than yourself. Serves me right, I suppose." He opened a small leather book in front of him. "You are a member of the Jaeger family, I see. Good. Very good." "Why am I here?" "Data, Johann. You may wait outside." Ostwald gestured at the man-at-arms. They opened the door and quietly and discreetly vacated the room. Once they had gone, Ostwald steepled his fingers and started again. "Tell me, Herr Jaeger, are you familiar with the Skaven?" Felix felt like his heart was about to stop. His mouth felt suddenly dry. He considered his words very carefully indeed. "I know of them. I am not personally acquainted with any." Ostwald laughed again. It was a cold, mechanical laugh, and there was no humour in it. "Very good. I had understood that this was not the case." "What are you getting at?" Felix's nervousness made him sound snappish. He did not know the way this conversation was going, but he could imagine several possible outcomes, none of them pleasant. "Merely that you have served in the sewer watch, and you claim to your superiors that you had encountered them. Is that not the case?" "You know it is." "Yes, I do." Again, Ostwald smiled. "You do not seem to me a typical sewer jack, Herr Jaeger. The sons of rich merchants rarely leap at the chance to hunt goblins in our sewers." Felix was getting used to this by now. He was not as surprised as he might have been by the unexpected nature of the statement. He could see that this was all part of Ostwald's technique. He liked to keep people he was dealing with off balance. It was like getting the measure of your opponent in a duel. Felix smiled back at him. "I am the black sheep of my family." "Indeed. How interesting. You must explain to me how that came about sometime." "I suspect you already know." Perhaps. Let us return to the Skaven, Herr Jaeger. How many times have you encountered them?" "On several occasions." "How many precisely?" Felix counted the number of times he was prepared to admit to. There was the encounter in the sewer. There was the attack on the blind pig. There was his fight in the Gardens of Moor. He decided that under the circumstances it might be undiplomatic to mention his meeting with the rat ogre in von Hallstatt's house and his battle with the warlocks of Skryre in the College of Engineering. 3. Ostwald consulted his book again. Another piece of the puzzle fitted into place, Felix thought to himself. He doesn't really know anything. He's just fishing. Its style is to intimidate people and then see what they let slip. Of course, thought Felix, this knowledge will do you no good. If he orders you taken down into the dungeons and tortured, he decided to try a few questions himself. On whose authority are you doing this? He asked. The Elector Countess Emmanuel's, Ostwald said with absolute certainty. Why do you ask? I am just trying to work out what is going on here. Ostwald gave him a long, cold, chilling smile. I can explain that to you quite easily, Herr Jäger. What do you know of Fritz von Hallstatt? Once again, Felix felt his heart leap into his mouth. He fought to keep his guilt and surprise off his face. A slight amusement flickered in Ostwald's eyes, told him that the man had noticed. It's a familiar name, he said. I think I saw him once at my brother's club. Very good, Herr Jäger. Allow me to share something with you. On the understanding, on your word as a gentleman, that nothing I tells you goes beyond the confines of this room. The tone in which the words were said told Felix that Ostwald was not simply counting on his word as a gentleman. Felix did not doubt that there would be serious and violent reprisals if he betrayed the man's confidence. Please, go ahead. You have my word I will tell no one. Fritz von Hallstatt was murdered. Felix thought he was going to be struck down on the spot. He felt sure that his guilt was written all over his face and that Ostwald was going to summon the guard and have him thrown into a dungeon. By the Skaven. Felix let out a long, rushing sigh of relief. I can see you are appalled, Herr Jäger. Am I? Felix collected his wits. I mean, aren't I just? Yes, it's a terrifying thought, isn't it? I will tell you something else. Fritz von Hallstatt was no ordinary servant of the crown. He was the chief of Her Serenity's secret police. We think he must have discovered some Skaven plot and been murdered because of it. If you'd used the word joined instead of discovered, I would have to agree with you, Felix thought. But what he said instead was, what makes you think this? In the burned out remains of his home, we found the skeleton of a creature that was not human. We suspect that it was some monster conjured by the Skaven to assassinate von Hallstatt. He must have fought with it and killed it, then died of his wounds. The house was probably set on fire during their struggle. Go on. Interestingly enough, soon after that, there was an attempt on your life. As far as I know, you and your associate, the dwarf Gurnison, were the only people who had then claimed to have seen the Skaven. Perhaps this was an effort to cover their tracks. I think I see what you mean. There are other things you may not know, Herr Jäger, and I tell them now only so you will realize the seriousness of the situation. You may have heard that there was a fire at the College of Engineering. Yes. What you may not be aware of is that this fire was the work of the Skaven too. I assure you, Herr Jäger, this is nothing to smile about. The gods were against those rat-man devils in one way. There seems to have been some sort of accident, for we have found many Skaven corpses at the scene. "Why have I not heard more of this?" Felix said. "You would have, except that Her Serenity deemed it wise to avoid a panic, and a panic there would surely be if the common herd were to find out that our city is under siege by the Skaven." Felix was astonished. After many fruitless attempts by himself to get someone to take the Skaven threat seriously, someone was trying to convince him it wasn't real. He did not know whether to laugh or be angry. He decided to play the part allotted to him, for on consideration, he realized that showing more knowledge than Oswald believed him to have could easily prove dangerous. "I am not joking, Herr Jaeger. Since you and Gurnason reported the presence of Skaven war parties in the sewers, there have been other sightings, skirmishes even, and bands of the Ratmen have even raided our docks by night, stealing food and even a grain barge. I tell you, we are under siege." "Siege? Isn't that a little strong? Where are the armies, the war engines, the chittering hordes?" "They are strong words, Herr Jaeger, and in truth the situation calls for them. The chief of secret police assassinated, citizens assaulted, a great imperial armory destroyed, and now the threat of plague. Now, Herr Jaeger, I know you take this seriously. I know you have some knowledge of this. We have a mutual acquaintance, and he has told me all about your actions in this matter." Mutual acquaintance? Oswald produced a pomander similar to the one that hung around Felix's neck. He held it beneath his nose and breathed deeply from it before setting it down upon the desk. "I refer, of course, to Herr Dr. Drexler. He has told me about your visit to the Gardens of Moor and what you found there. He treated your henchman, after all." "How do you know Dr. Drexler?" Felix asked to buy some time. He fervently hoped Oswald never referred to Gotrek as his henchman within the Slayer's hearing. "As a patient and a friend, he is the physician to many noble families. But I see that you are aware of another and deeper connection. I suspected a man of your resources might." Felix had been going to ask, but why did Drexler tell you all this? But he decided to keep his mouth shut and see what coldly clever explanation this cold and clever man came up with. "I tell you this only because the situation is truly desperate, Herr Jaeger, and we badly need your help." Things must be desperate indeed, thought Felix, if you need my help, particularly when I haven't a clue about what you're talking about. "Drexler and I are both initiates of the Order of the Hammer." As he said this, he made a peculiar variation of the sign of the hammer over his heart, reversing the normal order of left, right, center, down. "You have heard of us?" "Some sort of Sigmarite secret society," Felix guessed. It was not a difficult guess to make. The hammer was the sign of the Imperial cult, and there were many strange hidden societies with their own signs and passwords. "That is correct. An order of dedicated men sworn to protect our ancient civilization from the threat of chaos. We share many goals and much ancient knowledge. He tells me that Aldred himself chose you as his successor." Successor? Felix was bewildered. "You bear his blade, Herr Jaeger. You knew the man." I know Herr Aldred was a member of several secret orders as well as the one to which he normally belonged. He was a devout and fearless man, Herr Jaeger. Much like yourself, he dedicated himself to fighting the forces of chaos wherever he found them. I do not belong to his order. I can understand that you would deny this, Herr Jaeger. Herr Aldred belonged to many orders with even stricter vows of secrecy than our own. I will not press you on this. Just as well, Felix thought wryly. Otherwise you'd find out exactly the depth of my ignorance. Oswald paused for a moment and then spoke as if trying to change the subject. Drexler tells me that you possess a great deal of knowledge yourself. I possess only a little. It may be the little you know is actually a great deal, Herr Jaeger. Tell me about this strange Skaven who writes you the letters of warning. How did you meet it? So, Felix thought, this is where all this talk of secret societies and grave threats is leading. It is an attempt to get this information. He realized that Drexler must have reported their entire conversation to Oswald, so he saw no sense in hiding anything about the letter. I have never met it, Felix said honestly. In truth, I have no idea why it has selected me to communicate with. Perhaps it hasn't. Perhaps it has chosen Gotrek. That seems unlikely, Herr Jaeger, given the dwarf's avocation. No, I am convinced that you are the chosen one. Why? Perhaps because I can read? You can read Skaven runes? No, but I can read Imperial script. So the letter was written in Imperial script. Oswald looked astonished. Of course. How else could I read it? You have these letters on you? No, they vanish in a puff of smoke 5 heartbeats after I read them, Felix said ironically. He was going to add that he did not normally carry the letters on his person, but Oswald interrupted him. Powerful sorcery indeed. Herr Jaeger, you must understand something. I have taken over Fritz von Hallstatt's duties. The security of this great state of Nuln lies in my hands. Should this Skaven contact you again, you must inform me at once. Nothing would please me more, Felix said sincerely. No, please take me seriously, Herr Jaeger. I sense that you know more than you are currently willing to tell me. That is fair. We must all have our little secrets, but I must insist that you let me know. I want no more midnight forays into the graveyards. I know you are a brave and resourceful man, but these things are best dealt with by the authorities. I agree completely. Good, Herr Jaeger. Do not attempt to deceive me in this. My reach is long. I would not dream of it. You have my word. Good. Then you are free to go. Just remember. Do not worry, Herr Oswald. Rest assured, I will inform you as soon as I learn anything of the Skaven's plans, Felix said, fervently hoping against hope that he never ever came into possession of such information ever again. Isaac Grottle pulled himself from his palanquin and lumbered over to the great barred window. His breathing was heavy, and already he felt hungry. It had been a long trudge through the underways to reach this secret burrow. Soon it would be time to eat once more. He congratulated himself. It was amazing from what simple sources the most brilliant of inspiration sprang. The entire enormous effort of this secret research warren had sprung from his own hunger. He doubted that any other Skaven would ever have thought of something so simple and yet so inspired. Let others come up with intricate and complex schemes, thought Grottle. Soon he would demonstrate to all of them that the simplest plans were the best. He looked down into the great warp vats and saw the monsters taking shape within their bubbling, glowing, feeding fluids. He inspected the massive warpstone orbs which fed carefully measured jolts of mutating power into the vats when the watching vat masters deemed the conditions perfect. The rank smell of ozone and strange chemicals wafted up and made his nostrils twitch. It was a reassuring smell to them, the smell of the warrens in which his clan had raised him, from where he had begun the long climb to the power that he wielded today. He smiled, showing his great yellow fangs, and felt the pangs of his dreadful hunger once more. All Skavens suffered from it from time to time, usually after combat or some other violent activity. They called it the Black Hunger, and for most of them it was a sign of triumph, an indicator that they could devour prey. Isaac Grottle suffered from it all the time. He had long suspected that continual exposure to warpstone dust and mutagenic chemicals had done something to him. He would not be the first clan moulder packmaster to acquire the stigmata of some mutation, nor would he be the last. In his case, he also suspected that the change had done something to his brain, stimulated it, made him much cleverer and more cunning than other Skaven, rewarded him with fantastic insight. That was why he needed to eat so much, of course, to fuel his incredible mind. He stuffed his own tail into his mouth to try to control the terrible hunger pangs. Great gobs of saliva drooled down the bulbous flesh. He had already devoured every last scrap of the huge mound of dried meat he had intended to see him through his visit. He knew there was nothing much edible in this alchemical laboratory except his own bearers, and in fairness, they had done nothing today to displease them. The jars all around contained mostly toxic chemicals, nothing there for him. He breathed deeply and fought to bring his appetite back under control. Skitch looked up at him nervously. Grottle could tell that the little hunchbacked Skaven was uneasy. Perhaps he was thinking of all the other lackeys which rumour claimed that the packmaster had devoured. Grottle licked his lips with his long pink tongue. As he liked to tell of all his research vermin, those rumours were utterly true. The light of warpstone lanterns illuminated the pebble-thick lenses that Skitch used to compensate for his bad eyesight. Grottle nodded his head and switched his tail just for the pleasure of seeing Skitch leap back nervously. Skitch was small and weak, and so near-sighted that he could hardly see one paw in front of his face without his glasses. In many other Skaven clans, such weakness would have soon caused him to be killed and eaten. But Clan Moulder had recognized his potential and kept him alive, and for that, Grottle knew the little runt was truly grateful. And he had proven useful to Clan Moulder. Skitch was quite possibly the best vat master in the long and glorious history of the clan. He was a genius when it came to breeding and moulding all manner of beasts. Now he held out the cage that contained what was most likely to be Clan Moulder's greatest triumph. HUGE Gotrek took the cage and inspected its contents. It was a huge, sleek, fat female rat, already pregnant by the looks of things. The untrained eye would detect very little different from an ordinary rat, Gotrek thought. Perhaps they would think it was a little larger, a bit more vicious. Perhaps they would even notice the wicked gleam of some abnormal emotion in its eye. But they would never suspect that they were looking at one of the most potent weapons the world had ever known. "It doesn't look much, does it?" Gotrek said in his slow, deep, rumbling voice. "Does it?" Gotrek liked to repeat himself. He was proud of his voice, so powerful and so unlike a normal Skaven voice. Skitch knew a cue when he heard one. "Perhaps not, master, but their appearances are deceptive." The Vat Master's voice was unusually high for a Skaven's, and his words had an odd insinuating quality. "This beauty will lay waste to entire cities, will bring nations to their knees, will cause the world to bow before the genius of Clan Moulder." Gotrek nodded in a slow, satisfied way. He knew this was true. He just liked to hear himself say it. "You are sure there will be no problems, Skitch? Absolutely sure?" Yes, master. I am certain. We have bred thousands of these creatures, and we have tested many of them to destruction in the approved manner." Good. And what did you find?" "They have a huge appetite for almost any material. They will eat wood and waste as nothing else is available, but mostly they seek out and devour grain, meat, and other foodstuffs." "Excellent." "They can consume their own body weight in less than 100 heartbeats and be ready again to eat in hours." "You have done splendidly, Skitch. Splendidly." The hunchback seemed almost to swell with the effects of the praise. "And they can breed in litters of up to 100. "They grow quickly, of course." "They reach full mature size within a day, providing they find enough to eat." "And the breeders?" "Can bear a litter each day, every day, as you specified, master." Gotrek threw back his head and let his deep, rumbling laughter pour forth. Such a simple idea, he thought. When these rats were released into the human city, they would consume all the food within days. All the stored crops from the harvest would be devoured. All the food in shops would vanish underneath a furry avalanche of hunger. They would eat and breed unstoppably. And when no other food was available, they would eat the humans and their animals. And when all other food stocks were exhausted, they would consume each other or die. Their lifespan was measured only in days, but before that happened, the humans would starve or flee from their city, and the triumph would belong to Clan Moulder. Word would soon reach the Council of 13, and a suitable reward would be found for HUGE Gotrek. "We are ready to begin?" "Yes, master. We have the captured grain barge almost ready. The conversion will be done in days. We will ship the specimens to where it is hidden. It can begin its journey any time you wish after that." Perfect. The human warehouses were near the docks. All they would have to do would be to take the boat into the harbour and open the cages. A few disposable house troops could see to that easily enough. Perhaps some rat ogres just to be on the safe side.
Do so as soon as the preparations are complete.
Of course, master.
You say you have thousands more of these, Grottle said, reaching into the cage to stroke the sleek, fat rat.
Yes, master. Why?
Because I'm feeling a little peckish.
With that, Isaac Grottle grasped the somnolent rat and stuffed it, still living, into his salivating mouth. It was still struggling futilely as it went down his throat. It tasted good, thought Grottle, just like victory.